It begins with a storm, not on the battlefield but in memory. A name that once shook Europe, now almost erased. Thomas-Alexandre Dumas, the first black general in the history of France. A man born a slave who rose to command 53,000 white soldiers. A hero so fierce, Austrian troops called him the Black Devil. But when the tides of power shifted, when Napoleon crowned himself emperor, Dumas' name vanished from history. His body broken, his honor buried, his legacy stolen. And yet 2 generations later, his son would resurrect him. Not in politics, not in war, but in story. The Count of Monte Cristo, the Three Musketeers. Those were not fictions. They were echoes of a real man. A man who lived, bled, and died for liberty. This is his story. A story of empire and revolution, of genius and betrayal, of a hero who was born between 2 worlds and was devoured by both. Our story begins in 1762 in the French colony of Saint-Domingue, today Haiti. It was the richest colony in the world, a land of sugar and blood, where nearly 500,000 Africans toiled under the sun so that Europe could drink its sweetness. Among them was a woman named Marie-Cécile Dumas, enslaved, African, unknown. And the man who enslaved her, Marquis Alexandre Antoine David de la Pailletterie. From that forbidden union came a child, Thomas-Alexandre. Legally, he was born a slave, but his father, and perhaps out of guilt, perhaps out of pride, took the boy away from the Caribbean when he was 14. They sailed to France, a land where slavery had been outlawed since the Middle Ages. The moment Thomas stepped ashore, he was free. In France, he received an education fit for a young aristocrat. He learned Latin, fencing, philosophy, and from another mixed-race legend, the Chevalier de Saint-Georges, he learned the art of the sword. He was tall, over 6 feet, with black curls and skin closer to ebony than bronze. By all accounts, he was striking, charismatic, and proud. But France, for all its ideals, was still chained by prejudice. Thomas's father, fearful of scandal, forced him to adopt another name when he joined the army. And so in 1786, Alexandre Dumas enlisted as a private in the Queen's Dragoons, the name he took from his mother to honor her. He was 24, a nobleman's son turned soldier, a man of color in an all-white army, determined to prove his worth not by birth, but by courage. When the French Revolution erupted in 1789, Dumas was ready. He believed in its promise, liberty, equality, fraternity, not as slogans, but as the essence of his own life. The revolution tore down the old order, and suddenly, for the first time, talent could rise above title. Dumas seized that moment. Within a few years, the former private became General Dumas, commander of the Army of the Alps, a force of 53,000 men. In 1794, France faced enemies on every border. Dumas was sent to the mountains, where Austrian and Piedmontese troops blocked the passes. His orders opened the road, but the Alps were not a battlefield. They were an ice-covered tomb. Snowdrifts buried the men. Horses froze mid-stride. Entire divisions vanished into the white. And yet Dumas pressed on. He led his troops up the mountains, scaling cliffs with ice axes and rope, cutting steps into the frozen rock. When his officers warned him it was impossible, he simply said, "We are French. Nothing is impossible." They captured Mont Cenis Pass, a feat so daring that the newspapers called it a miracle of audacity. It opened the way for France's second Italian campaign. From that moment, Dumas was a legend. But his victories did not end in the Alps. In 1796, he joined the army of Italy, commanded by a rising star, Napoleon Bonaparte. The two men could not have been more different. Napoleon, small, brilliant, ambitious, calculating. Dumas, tall, fiery, uncompromising, a believer in justice.
General, the latest dispatch.
They fought side by side at Mantua, Tyrol, and Clausen, where Dumas, single-handedly leading a counterattack across a bridge, drove back a squadron of Austrian cavalry. The Austrians began calling him Der Schwarze Teufel, the Black Devil. To the French, he was the Horatius Cockles of the Tyrol, the man who held the bridge alone. Even Napoleon admired him then, gifting him a pair of pistols. But admiration would soon turn to resentment. By 1798, Dumas' fame had spread across Europe. He had served as commander in the Pyrenees, in the Vendée, in the Alps, always victorious, always loyal to the Republic. He had one flaw: he spoke his mind. When Napoleon prepared his grand expedition to Egypt, Dumas was made commander of cavalry. Second only to Napoleon himself, it should have been his greatest triumph. Instead, it was the beginning of his downfall. The march across the desert from Alexandria to Cairo was hell. 40-degree heat, no water, men dying of thirst, horses collapsing in the sand. Dumas saw the suffering, and he spoke out, accusing Napoleon of vanity, of risking lives for glory. Napoleon never forgave him. At the Battle of the Pyramids, Dumas' cavalry crushed the Mamluk horsemen, but the tension between the two generals was palpable. The soldiers whispered, "Who is the real commander? The small Corsican or the black giant on horseback?" When a revolt erupted in Cairo, Dumas led the charge into the Al-Azhar Mosque to rescue French prisoners, an act of reckless bravery that Napoleon later claimed as his own. Dumas asked to return to France. Napoleon agreed, but not before ensuring the ship was the smallest, least seaworthy vessel available. In March of 1799, the general set sail aboard La Belle Maltaise with a handful of wounded men and a cargo of Arabian horses. A storm struck, forcing them ashore in the Kingdom of Naples, then at war with France. Dumas expected a friendly port. Instead, he was thrown into a dungeon, accused of being a spy, stripped of his rank, and forgotten for 2 years. He languished in a stone cell beneath the castle of Taranto. He was starved, half blind, paralyzed, and, he believed, slowly poisoned. In Paris, Napoleon seized power, and when Dumas' wife begged the new emperor to free her husband, her letters went unanswered. The hero who had once saved France froze in the darkness of a Neapolitan prison. When he was finally released in 1801, the war was over. His body was broken, his career destroyed. He returned home to Villers-Cotterêts, to his wife, Marie-Louise, and to their newborn son, Alexandre. The little boy would never remember the father who carried him on his shoulders, but he would spend his life chasing his ghost. France had moved on. Napoleon, now emperor, had no use for a black general who symbolized equality. Dumas was denied pension, rank, and recognition. He wrote letter after letter, begging for justice, not for riches, only for his due. None were answered. He spent his final years in quiet poverty, crippled from his imprisonment, his family surviving on his wife's meager income. On February 26, 1806, Thomas-Alexandre Dumas died of stomach cancer. He was 43 years old. At his funeral, there were no generals, no medals, no flags, only villagers, and a widow with 2 children. He was buried without a stone. As poet Charles Wolfe once wrote of another fallen soldier, "We carved not a line, and we raised not a stone, but we left him alone with his glory." But death is not the end for men like him. 2 generations later, his son, Alexandre Dumas, became one of the greatest writers in French history. His novels, The Three Musketeers, The Count of Monte Cristo, The Man in the Iron Mask, were all haunted by the same theme: betrayal, injustice, redemption. In The Count of Monte Cristo, Edmond Dantes, a man wrongfully imprisoned, forgotten, and reborn, is none other than the reflection of his father. Through fiction, the son gave voice to the silence of the father. Through story, the Black Devil lived again. Thomas-Alexandre Dumas was more than a soldier.
forget your place,
He was
General.
proof that ideals could be flesh and blood, that liberty, equality,
Move the horses
fraternity
out.
could
We
ride a
leave for the
horse,
coast
draw a
at
sword,
once.
and command an army. He embodied the revolution's promise and its betrayal. Because when France declared all men equal, he rose higher than anyone imagined. But when it returned to empire, his very existence became inconvenient. He was erased. His statues melted, his memory rewritten, his skin turned invisible in paintings. It took more than a century for France to remember. Today, his name is carved into the Arc de Triomphe in Paris. A monument stands again in his honor. Broken slave shackles cast in bronze, reaching for the sky. It's not just a monument to one man. It's a monument to the idea he lived for, that greatness is not born of blood, but of courage, and that the measure of a man is not where he begins, but how he stands when the world tries to break him. In the end, Thomas-Alexandre Dumas' story is not tragedy. It's resurrection. He was born a slave. He became a general. He defied an emperor. He died forgotten. But his spirit lived on, in words, in myth, and in the heartbeat of freedom itself. And perhaps when we read The Count of Monte Cristo or The Three Musketeers, we are not escaping history. We are hearing it speak. The echo of a man who believed in justice when the world had none. A man the world once feared and then forgot. The Black Devil of France. The general who rode for liberty. Thomas-Alexandre Dumas. If you've watched this far, you now know the forgotten story behind The Count of Monte Cristo. The man who fought for liberty and paid the price for being ahead of his time. If you'd like to see more stories of real heroes history tried to erase, like, share, and subscribe. Because history is not just what happened, it's what we remember.